Not my fault. Honest. No. I did part one and it didn't, it blew up. So, I like this stuff. Coconut water. Pure coconut water. Hydrate naturally. I used to, when I first found this stuff, I was like, I got one bottle of it. I took it like a sip a day, and I was like, and I got a whole bunch of, they had some at the discount grocery over here. Polk County Discount Grocery. Okay, so I got to do chapter 1 over. So some of you might listen to chapter 2 and 3 before you get to chapter 1. Gee, sorry about that, Chief. Nothing I did, it just blew up. I don't know why. It wasn't too long, I don't think. Who knows? Alright. Mark wondered why Connie would have a reason to be mad at him. It was her choice to go with Craig, and he had chosen to go to his sister's, mostly of his own accord. Well, he thought, since when did women need a good reason to be angry? Mark put it out of his mind. Craig and Connie weren't his problem anymore. It was going to be a beautiful day. It had been chilly early in the morning, but it was warming up nicely now that the sun was overhead. The windows were down on the blazer, and Mark had on his sunglasses. The sky held a few wisps of white clouds that were hurriedly making their way north. If only the radio would play, it would be perfect. He looked in the rearview mirror and saw that David's eyes were closed. George was looking out his window. Mark decided that now was a good time. George? The older man turned his head toward the driver. Mark could see that he was smiling, but his eyes held a sadness. Thanks for bringing me, Mark. Nowadays, a trip anywhere is a treat. I'm really going to miss seeing the fields of crops when I drive by. You could just catch a glimpse down each row as you pass, and then it's gone, and you see the next for an instant. And that's how the days are. Each one passes so quickly. Mark smiled at the analogy. Everything must take on a deeper meaning when you know your time is short. Did you want to ask me something? George asked. Yes, I want to know if you thought it might be a good idea for you to take an apprentice. I know the book will help us a lot, but some things are better passed on in person. I've been thinking the same thing. George seemed a little surprised. Good. Do you have anyone in mind? Mark asked. I was thinking about Alex Petrie. He's in FFA, Future Farmers of America, and he really has an interest. He's always asking me questions and pestering me to let him drive the tractor. I think he would be the natural choice. Alex Petrie? Mark asked. A little young, isn't he? That wasn't Mark's real objection, of course. There you go. He's almost 18, and he's sharp. No one else in the neighborhood really has the fire to learn like he does. Don't get me wrong, everyone wants to help, but they just want to do what I tell them. Alex is the only one to ever ask why. Was all that Mark said. Mark wished that the fire to learn was the only fire the boy had. Alex the farmer, Mark thought about it. Maybe that would work. Sam would never have any interest in a farmer, would she? She wanted to be a doctor. What would a farmer and a doctor have in common? This might work out. If you think he's the right one, then let's go for it. Okay. I just have one concern, George said. What's that? George looked over his shoulder at David. People are going to wonder why I'm teaching him. Someone might put 2 and 2 together and guess that I'm sick. I see what you mean, Mark nodded his head thoughtfully. What if we assigned apprentices to everyone with crucial knowledge? We really ought to do that anyway. I don't know why I haven't thought of it before. We need backups for Lisa, Doc, Gunny, Shapar already has one, you, and maybe some others. If we did it that way, no one would suspect anything, and we should have them write down things like you did, too. Mark was excited about this proposal. That sounds like a good idea, George agreed. He smiled a happy smile this time. They had just crossed back into Wilson County when Mark heard an all-too-familiar sound. It sounded like firecrackers, but he knew instantly that it was gunfire. He slammed on the brakes and brought the Chevrolet to a halt. David woke up and looked around, confused. George had a worried look on his face as well. The firing was coming from in front of them. Mark couldn't imagine that someone had set up a roadblock in the little time since they had come this way. He eased the truck almost to the top of the hill and stopped. He grabbed his FAL and hopped out of the truck. George and David were grabbing their gear and getting out of the truck behind him. You two stay here and let me check it out, Mark told them. David's shoulders slumped, and George looked at Mark with disapproval. Would you tell Gunny and Jim to stay in the truck? George asked. No, but they have experience with this stuff, Mark answered. And how did they get experience? George followed up. Mark realized that George had a point. If the lights didn't come on soon, everyone was going to be faced with this kind of situation sooner or later. Might as well see how he does, Mark thought, looking at his son. Okay, look, I don't have time to argue. You can both come, but stay behind me and don't do anything unless I tell you, okay? Okay, George answered. Yes, sir, David replied. Mark waited for his two teammates to get out of the truck with their gear. He then headed for the crest of the hill at a trot. When he was close, he bent over so that his head couldn't be seen on the other side. About 10 yards from the top, he dropped and crawled the rest of the way. He checked over his shoulder and was pleased to see George and David copying him. He crept the last few feet and peered over the top. He was surprised to see there was no roadblock. The firing was coming from a house about 300 yards off of the road at the bottom of the hill. The residents were firing at a group hidden behind a couple of huge bales of hay about 100 yards in front of the house and next to the driveway. Right next to the hay was a large garden plot. A sign next to the main gate said Calvert's Horse Farm. Mark pulled his binoculars out of his pack and glassed the area. There were 4 people behind the bales, but only 2 of them were firing. One had a handgun, the other a small rifle, probably a .22, from the looks and sound of it. There were at least 4 rifles being fired from the house. It almost appeared that people behind the bales of hay were on the defensive. They only fired occasionally and only took quick, poorly aimed shots. Mark would have been surprised if they managed to hit the house at all. The people in the house, however, were shooting regularly at the bales of hay. Mark didn't know what to make of the situation. Are we going to help them, Dad? David asked. I don't know who to help, Dave. The ones in the house have to be the good guys, David said. Not necessarily, son. It looks to me like the ones behind the hay would like to leave, but they can't. Plus, if you're going to attack that house, you would need a lot more than 2 guns. So you think the ones inside are the bad guys? I didn't say that. I really don't know what to think. Mark looked at George and only got a shrug of the farmer's shoulders for an answer. A second later, Mark thought he heard a siren. Did you hear that? David asked excitedly. The cops are coming. Mark definitely heard it now, and the siren grew stronger each second. He looked down the road with his binoculars. From this vantage point, he could see 2 or 3 miles. As he focused, a squad car came over the hill and into his view. A moment later, the van that the sheriff's department was using for a paddy wagon followed it. The squad car quickly covered the distance, and when it reached the gate, it stopped. Mark heard Kurt's voice over the loudspeaker. This is the sheriff. You people behind the hay, put down your weapons and put your hands up. Jack Calvert, you and your people, hold your fire. Everyone complied with the sheriff, and he drove up to where the 4 outsiders were standing with their hands over their heads. The paddy wagon was right behind him, and a total of 6 officers got out of the 2 vehicles. 4 of the deputies were using AR-15s to cover the men and women, while the sheriff questioned them. Mark decided to drive down and see what was going on. George, David, and Mark walked back to the truck and drove down to where the sheriff was questioning the 4 who had been behind the hay bales. When Kurt saw Mark, he walked over to the Blazer. What are you doing here? The sheriff asked. Oh, it's good to see you too, Kurt, Mark smiled. I'm sorry. How are you? Fine, thanks. We were driving by when we heard the shooting. We stopped and we were watching from the top of the hill. Mark pointed behind him. I was trying to figure out what was going on when we heard you coming. So what's going on? All right. That was part 1.